Evening, everyone. It was a longer walk all around the chairs. Normally, you don't have that on a Sunday. Welcome. Welcome to our evening. I'm Pastor Phil. Glad that you're here. Welcome to our evening where it's pain, pandemics, and Putin is there hope for a broken world. That's what we're going to be thinking about. So nice, light, simple, relaxing subject. Nothing heavy here at all. Far from it. No. We're going to have a really good time, I think, and we're going to dig into some of these sorts of things. What we're also going to do is, after we've had the break with the desserts, and I'll explain that just before we do that, after that, then we're going to have a kind of question and answer session. And what we'd like to encourage you to do is to ask any question you like, really. It may be something to do with the talk. It may be something that you didn't understand or maybe didn't agree with. That's okay. We'd love to hear those kind of questions. There might be some other questions that you have. Maybe you think, well, what does the Bible say about this? Or why do these things happen in the world? Or whatever it might be. It might be questions of faith, life, whatever it might be. We'd love to hear those sorts of questions. So what we'd like you to do, again, on the tables, you'll see there's some question forms, and to write your questions on those forms. You don't have to do that straight away. You can do that during this and during the break, and then I'll take those questions, and then I will ask those questions on your behalf to Andy. So that means you can ask those questions anonymously then. So you can ask them real stinkers, if you like, and we'll see what we can do with them. I won't throw them away, but we'll see how many we get. We may not get through all of them, but we'll see how we go. And we'll go through those questions. So you'll see those on your tables as well. So we're going to go to our first part, which is really, as I say, trying to look at this question: pain, pandemics, and Putin. Is there hope for a broken world? And I'm going to invite Andy to come and join me. So Andy Bannister is CEO of an organisation called Solas. So maybe before you start, Andy, perhaps kind of tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, a little bit about Solas, and I'll get off.
That would be great, thank you. Well, that would be great to tell you about, not that you would get off, Phil. Yes, good evening. My name is Andy Bannister. I came from Plymouth today, but actually I come from Swindon as home, so just the west of here. I head up an organisation called Solas, and Solas is originally a Scottish organisation, so Solas is the Gaelic word for light. And what we love doing at Solas, we really do two things. The first thing we like doing is taking the message of Jesus out of the four walls of churches and helping people think about the big questions of life and why I think Christianity makes sense of them. And then we also love helping equip those who are Christians, who do have a faith, to explain that better to their friends. So if you're here this evening and you would say, I'm somebody of no faith, I've come this evening because my neighbour invited me, or bribed me, or blackmailed me, hopefully there's something for you. And if you're here this evening because you are a follower of Jesus, again, hopefully there's something here for you this evening. But we love thinking about big questions at Solas. And so tonight's question really is a biggie. Pain, pandemics, and Putin. Is there hope for a broken world? Boy, do they give me easy topics to speak on at events like this. But to really set the scene for our answer to go this evening, we live, don't we? We live in a very fear-based culture, very fear-based culture, whether it is climate change or asteroid strikes or shark attacks or hyperinflation or pandemics or war in Europe, no matter whatever it is, our culture and our media seem obsessed with fear. And then, of course, we had that double whammy of the pandemic, and no sooner had we got over the pandemic than Vladimir Putin came across the horizon. I was reading the paper the other day, and I came across a new word, a word I hadn't heard before that kind of sums up where many of us are at. Even if you've never heard this word, you can probably work out what it is. It's the word doom scrolling. Doom scrolling has become a thing. Doom scrolling is that phenomena where you sit on your phone, often late at night, in a depressed little heap on the sofa, reading miserable story after miserable story after miserable story, feeling worse and worse and worse. In fact, I remember thinking back to the pandemic. I wonder how many of you remember the BBC's daily death ticker of doom, where every day across the bottom of the screen they would tell you how many people had died. And of course now we've gone from there and now we're into Ukraine. And I've lost track of how many articles I've read in the last year on different newspapers and websites asking questions like, is this the start of World War III? And of course often I don't know if you've noticed this, our media and the news actually kind of spiral off each other. They loop off each other. A good example of that would be, I think, knowing full well what Western media is like. Very early on in the Ukraine conflict, Vladimir Putin started referring to nuclear weapons, if you remember, because he knows what the Western media is like. He knows that there'd be lots of news stories and there'd be lots of panic and everyone would sit there going, oh my word, everything is over. I think my favourite, if that's the right word, my favourite depressing sort of nuclear-related story from the last year was about 5 months ago. The BBC ran a story reporting how the price of old nuclear fallout shelters from the Cold War days has gone through the roof. So if you are thinking of buying a nuclear shelter, you want to move now, is my advice to you. But more seriously, I've caught myself doom scrolling. I've caught myself sometimes late at night scrolling through the news and getting depressed, bringing back memories actually for me of growing up in the 1980s when similarly everyone was afraid of was it going to be the end of everything. But here's the thing I want us to think about a bit this evening. For all that the pandemic and then Vladimir Putin have done to our adrenaline levels, I wonder if we've given those things a little bit too much credit. I wonder if we've given both COVID and Vladimir a bit too much credit. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that in the last few decades in the West, we have enjoyed unprecedented peace and prosperity. We have, up until recently, lived in one of the most prosperous, one of the safest times in the world and in history. And I wonder whether that has lulled some of us to sleep. We've actually begun to forget about the fact that historically and globally, the world is actually a pretty dangerous place. I was recently reading an old essay by the writer and thinker, Christian theologian C.S. Lewis. And in 1948, C.S. Lewis, shortly after the end of World War II, writes an essay for a newspaper. I think it was The Times. And it was reflecting on the question of how do we live in a world where now the nuclear bomb has been invented? Because that was a new technology. What do we do with the fact that the world might end tomorrow? And I read his little essay and I thought, interesting, some things never really change. Listen to what C.S. Lewis wrote all those years ago. He said, in one way, we think a great deal too much of the atomic bomb. How are we to live in an atomic age? I am tempted to reply, why, as you would have lived in the 16th century, when the plague visited London almost every year. Or as you would have lived in a Viking age, when raiders from Scandinavia might land and cut your throat at any night. Or indeed, as you are already living in an age of cancer, an age of syphilis, an age of paralysis, an age of air raids, an age of railway accidents, an age of motor accidents. And the point Lewis is getting at there in that essay is that everybody dies. We may not like that reality. We may try and hide death away behind hospital doors and kind of sanitize it. We may try and distract ourselves from thoughts of our own mortality with endless Amazon shopping splurges and Netflix binges. But the reality is that all of us in this room, every human being, is going to die at some point. Whether it's Putin going mad and pressing the red button, whether it's some new pandemic making COVID look like a Girl Guides picnic, whether it's simply the number 93 bus flattening you as you walk across the road and don't look the right way, at some point your number will be up. There is nothing different about that for our generation than it is from any generation in history. But some might say, hang on a moment, Andy, that's all true. I know we're all going to die, but isn't the modern fear, isn't the problem with pandemics, and isn't the problem with Putin the fact that they're so massive? Global pandemics, environmental disasters, an asteroid strike, nuclear war, some horrific new pathogen. Don't these threaten the whole of civilization itself? After all, the number 93 bus or a heart attack might shuffle one of us off this mortal coil, but those things threaten everything. So surely, we're right to doom scroll and sit there in a depressed little heap on the sofa at 2 in the morning. Well, if that's your reaction, again, a news flash for you this evening, namely that people have always known, human beings have always known that if nature is all that there is, if nature is all that there is, then humanity is pretty much doomed, entirely doomed, in fact. Let me cheer you up even further this evening. The second half of the talk is less depressing, but I've got to go down before we can go up. Let me just cheer you up with one more very cheerful quotation. This is from Bertrand Russell, one of the most influential 20th century atheists, not a believer in any kind of God, in fact, quite the opposite. But he wrote a very famous essay looking at this whole question of hope and is there any to be found given the kind of way the world is. Listen to his conclusions. He wrote, "Man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end that they were achieving. His origins, his growth, his hopes and his fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. No fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve the individual life beyond the grave. All the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and the whole temple of man's achievements must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built." Cheerful stuff. And I look at that and go, there's a reason why he was a philosopher and not a motivational speaker. Cheery stuff. But I'm actually afraid it gets a little bit more, less cheerful than that. Because if nature is all that there is, if we live in a godless universe, if all that exists are atoms and particles, not merely is the outlook hopeless, as Dr. Russell pointed out, but the outcome is also justiceless. Because if nature is all that there is, if atoms and particles is all that there is, how do we get to stand here and say that Vladimir Putin is wrong? He is simply one particular arrangement of atoms who's behaving in one particular way, but by what right, by what standard do we have to sit here and judge him? By what standard do we have to judge the Chinese genocide of the Uyghur people? By what right do we have to stand here and go that oppression and injustice and slavery and violence and human trafficking are unjust? After all, if you can kill millions like Putin's predecessor Stalin and get away with it, there is no God, there is no judgment day, there is no standard to which you'll be held. So much for justice. Well, I confess this is all pretty depressing. If you came here this evening hoping for a nice drink, some sugar, and a really cheerful talk, I'm afraid you've possibly come to the wrong place. But you know what? To cheer you up in that case, here is a picture of a cat doing something funny. Very seriously, if nature is all that exists, this is the best that we have. We can go, gosh, let's just look at something funny. Let's distract ourselves. Let's just have a laugh so we don't have to look at the reality of what we're facing with. As one of my friends who is an atheist once put it to me, he said, atheism is a thoroughly depressing and miserable business if you take it seriously. Looking for hope, any kind of hope on this basis is, well, it's frankly insanity. It's not just trying to build a house on sand so much as trying to build a skyscraper on sand. So what is the answer? What is the answer? How do we find hope in a world like this? Well, in the old essay from 1948 by C.S. Lewis that I mentioned, Lewis suggests we have three options, actually. There are three things you can do if you decide that nature is all there is. If you want to throw God out and try and be an atheist, there are three things you can sort of try and do given the fact the universe is a miserable place and destined for destruction. Lewis said the first thing you can do is you can kind of conclude that I might as well end it all. Unyielding despair. You can embrace Bertrand Russell and go, you know what? Despair is the only option, but at least I can control the manner of my own going. And you can quite literally end your life. And if you think I'm being extreme, the French atheist thinker Albert Camus once said there is only one philosophical question, and that is suicide. In other words, if the universe is this bleak, why don't you just press the off switch? And with this response, you're saying basically everything is despairing, but the one thing I can do is at least I can control my response to it. Pretty depressing. So I don't think we want to go that route. Hopefully not this evening. What's the second option? Well, says Lewis, second thing you can do is you can try and distract yourself by having a good time. You could go, okay, the world's pretty depressing, all kinds of stuff going on. Let's just try not to look and let's amuse ourselves. That approach reminds me of the old Indian parable. There's an old Indian folk tale about a young man who finds himself stuck on a raft in a fast-moving river. And as he looks down the way the river is going, he's got no paddle, he's got no pole, he's stuck on this raft that's floating down the river. As he looks down the river, he sees about half-a-mile distance a suspicious-looking straight line in the river. It's a waterfall. It's Niagara Falls, or the Indian equivalent thereof. And he realizes he's got about 3 or 4 minutes until that raft goes over the falls to his doom. And he tries paddling, he tries flapping around. Nothing is happening. The raft just keeps going. Well, after 30 seconds or so of fighting, he decides the only thing to do is to lie back, put his hands behind his head, enjoy the sunny morning, and sing a couple of songs until the raft and he go splash to their watery end. And we're in a similar situation. We can do the same thing. We can say, well, okay, let's not think about Putin. Let's not think about mortality. Let's not think about asteroid strikes and it all ending. Let's just watch Netflix or music or love or some other pleasure to distract us from the big questions of life. Trouble is, of course, you have to constantly remind yourself, or avoid reminding yourself, that the thing you're enjoying is also meaningless. If atheism is true, music is just a random collection of noises. If atheism is true, love is just a chemical trick that your brain has played to get you to mate. And indeed, as the writer of the book of Ecclesiastes, one of the oldest books in the Bible, put it, describing this worldview, he said, if pleasure is all there is, well, all of it is meaningless, just a chasing after the wind. So what other options are there? Well, said Lewis, if nature is all that there is, and you don't want to go the drastic suicide route, you don't want to go the try and distract yourself route, it's the last thing you could try. Well, you could try defiance. You could kind of sort of shake your fist at the universe and go, I know we're all doomed. I know there is no justice, but I'm going to take a stand. I'm going to care. I'm going to fly a Ukrainian flag. I'm going to make a difference. I am going to take a stand and light a candle against the storm. Fantastic. Very brave. Wonderful. Congratulations. Problem is, it's also totally futile. It's ultimately totally futile because it's just your personal preference. Because over here stands Mr. Putin, who's made a different set of choices, and he says, well, good luck with that. I'm going to carry on brutalizing the Ukrainians. That's my choice, and who gets to tell me that I'm wrong? So, what is the alternative? Well, maybe the alternative here, maybe the problem is trying to solve the problem of pain, pandemics, and Putin, whilst assuming that nature is all there is. Maybe that is the problem. And maybe the way to begin moving from despair to hope is to think about the question, what if nature is not all that there is? See, the reason I pointed out to you some of the grimness and the darkness here, I sort of made light of it, but it is a little bit depressing, some of the stuff I've shared. But sometimes you need to look at the reality. Sometimes we need a diagnosis before we're able to actually consider the cure. And maybe some of us do need to take that hard, cold look at the reality that if nature is all there is no meaning, there is no justice, there is no purpose, and there is no hope. Sometimes we need to realize just what we're dealing with before we can listen, be willing to listen to that still, small voice that maybe for some of us is whispering, but what if? What if nature is not all that there is? Haven't some of you wondered this evening, haven't some of you ever really wondered if it is the case that we are just atoms and particles, why is it the things that we care the most about as human beings are things like justice and love and hope and identity and meaning, things that are light years removed from just atoms and particles banging about together? What if nature is not all that there is? What if nature is not all that there is? What if we are more than the stuff that we are made of? What if we are not just merely material creatures, but what if we are spiritual to some degree as well? And what if there is some kind of God behind the world? Because if there is, everything changes. All of the difficulties we've just explored are only difficulties if we live in a purely natural world. But if there is more to life than that, then everything I've said about how dark and despairing things are simply turns out to be false, because nature is not all there is. But of course, that last question I've thrown up there on the slide for you this evening, what if there is some kind of God? That itself begs one last question that's worth looking at for 3 or 4 minutes before we draw this part of the evening to a close and have some dessert. And that's the question, what kind of God are we talking about? What kind of God might we be talking about? Because the word God is one of those slippery words that people use in so many different ways. It doesn't take a lot of looking at the claims of the world's major faith traditions to tell you there are hundreds of different conceptions of God out there. Which one are we talking about? Well, I'm a Christian this evening, so I'm concerned with the God at the center of the Bible, the God about whom I believe we don't just need to think theoretically, but actually a God who, I believe, stepped into history in the person of Jesus, a God who has come to show us what he's like, and a God who has a huge amount to say about the whole subject of hope in the light of fear. In fact, in one of the books of the New Testament, the second half of the Bible, there was a little letter written by a guy called Peter, one of Jesus' earliest followers, one of his closest followers. And Peter writes a letter in the second half of the first century to Christians throughout the Roman Empire who were being persecuted for their faith. And towards the end of the first century AD, the Roman Empire took a grim dislike to Christians because they refused to worship Caesar, and so you would get persecuted very badly, you could lose your life for being a follower of Jesus. And Peter writes a letter to encourage them and challenge them and get them thinking a little bit. And at the start of this letter that he writes, he says these interesting words. He says, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, never spoil, or fade." I find that language there that Peter uses interesting. A living hope, Peter says. Christian hope is not some sort of hope for pie in the sky when you die. It's not wishful thinking. It's not crossing our fingers and hoping things might just get better despite the evidence of history. But Christian hope is grounded on the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, an event that took place in the full light of history, and to which Peter was himself an eyewitness. And by the way, if you want me to talk more about the historical evidence for the resurrection, throw that in as a question. I will happily do that during the Q&A. Yes, says Peter, life may be tough, but we can know with certainty that there is hope to be found for those of us who place our trust in Jesus, the one who has overcome death and decay. What kind of God? Well, I believe and I trust wholeheartedly in a God who made the world, a God who loves that world profoundly, including you and including me, despite our mess-ups, our brokenness, our screw-ups, the way that we have personally contributed to the world's hopelessness. And a God who doesn't just talk about that love, but demonstrated that love by stepping into history in the person of Jesus. And in all of this, as we think about what it means to live with hope in the face of darkness and despair and uncertainty, I find it quite helpful to look back to those in the past, like Peter, who've been through this, but others who've lived through difficult times more recently. One of my more recent heroes of history is a man whose name may be unknown to many of you. His name was Maximilian Kolbe. Who was Maximilian? Well, Maximilian was a Polish Catholic monk who in 1941 was arrested by the German Gestapo for his work involved in rescuing and smuggling Jews out of Poland and getting them across the border to safety. And the Germans caught wind of what he was doing and arrested him and flung him into Auschwitz concentration camp. 1 year after Maximilian's arrest, another prisoner escaped from Auschwitz. This so infuriated the German authorities that they decided they were going to teach a lesson to the other prisoners. And the commander of the camp gathered all the prisoners in the prison yard, and he announced that he was going to pick the name of 10 men at random, and those men would be taken away and locked up in an underground cell and left to die there in the dark with no food and no water, as a message. If you escape from Auschwitz, this is what we do to your friends. And true to his word, he read the name of 10 prisoners at random, and one of those men, when his name was read out, began screaming hysterically. Not unsurprisingly, he began crying out, my wife and my children, my family, whatever will become of them? On hearing those words, Maximilian stepped out of the crowd of prisoners, looked the commander squarely in the eye, and said, "Sir, may I take the place of that man?" The commander agreed, and the other father of the prisoner was released. Maximilian was taken away with those 9 others and locked up in that underground cell where they took 2 weeks to die. And we know that story because the man whose life he saved survived the war, was liberated in 1945, and spent the rest of his life telling what had been done for him. But why did Maximilian do that? Well, of course, he was a committed Christian, and he believed everything I've just said about nature not being the only thing. He believed there was a God who had stepped into history in the person of Jesus, and he believed in the words of Jesus, greater love has no one, that he laid down his life for his friends. But here's the thing. Is that just an inspiring story of someone lighting a candle in the face of darkness? Well, if we live in a godless universe, not merely is that the best it is, at worst, it's worse than that. It's even a case of saying Maximilian made a stupid mistake. He threw his life away. What an idiotic thing to do. All he had was his biological existence, and he threw it away for some crazy cause. If we live in a universe where nature is all that it is, that was a complete, meaningless gesture. But what if nature is not all that there is? What if there is a bigger, deeper story behind this world of ours? A story that gives us a basis for hope, yes, but also a basis for love and justice, the true story of this world that gives us a concrete foundation for love, a concrete foundation for believing that because there is a God behind this universe, that everything sad and bad will one day become undone. A foundation for believing that this life is not all that there is. A foundation for not just believing, but for knowing that death and decay and doom and destruction and plagues, pandemics and Putin, all those things are not the last word, but that love is the last word. You see, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that you and I, that all of us have a choice here this evening, a crucial choice. There is no real sitting on the fence on this issue, and not least sitting on the fence can be a particularly uncomfortable position, not least if the fence is made of barbed wire. You can close your eyes and your ears, put your fingers in your ears and go la la la, pretend everything is okay. You can refuse to confront this issue of how bad the world is and how badly we need hope. Or you can pursue that still small voice that says there is more than this. And you might take a closer look at the claims, the life, the death of Jesus, and see whether they really stand up and offer us that certainty that there is more than just atoms and particles to be found. You see, I believe there is. I believe there is hope to be found. Hope in the face of plagues, hope in the face of pandemics, hope in the face even of Vladimir Putin. But it's not a hope to be found in the world. It's a hope that can only be given to us as a gift from outside of it, from the one who made it, which is exactly, by the way, what Jesus was getting at when he said, I have come that you might have life and have it to the full. Thanks for listening.